In this video, we're going to be covering all of the DPS, both melee and ranged, and rank each one of them for the Vault of the Incarnates raid in Shadowlands. We're going to be rating each spec mainly on their performance, as well as taking into account the unique utility that some of them might bring to the table, so that they just won't be rated solely on how much DPS they do, but how much of a bigger role that they play. And just for a quick disclaimer, I just want to let you guys all know that balancing in this game happens a lot, so what's good right now might be bad or even better in a couple of weeks from now. But don't worry, because each time a new patch comes out, we will be revisiting the tier list to see where things have changed. But for right now, I would say with this list, I'm pretty happy with it. And lastly, if you guys haven't already, I would just like to ask you to please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Starting out with the S tier, we have the Outlaw Rogue. Outlaw is a strong spec to play in Dragonflight because of just how versatile they can be. They deal high amounts of AoE damage. Blade Flurry basically just allows them to go from single target to AoE in just one button. And did I mention how good they're doing right now? And aside from AoE, Outlaw does some pretty decent single target too. But that's not all, because they also have some really strong utility and powerful defensives like Cloak of Shadow and Cheat Death. That, combined with the new Entropy Poison, which basically makes them have Devotion Aura, like Paladins, makes them an awesome pick. Enhancement Shamans are killing it right now in Dragonflight because of the incredible single target and cleave damage that they can provide. This, plus the ability to provide Wind Fury Totem, makes them a very valuable pick to fill out any raid roster. And in fact, I would argue it's probably the only spec in the game that I would say bring two of them to your raid just to make sure that all of your melee have Wind Fury. But if Wind Fury wasn't enough to make them be just an awesome pick, they also provide Bloodlust and can self-revive. Assassination Rogues are brought to the raids for one single thing: their single target damage. Sin Rogues have the strongest single target damage in the entire game if you look at the overall damage. Just like Outlaw, they come with Antrophic Poison, strong defensives with Cloak of Shadow, and they're just straight up progression boss killers right now. I would argue every raid needs at least one Assassination Rogue in the roster, so if you'd like to play a DPS spec that's got a slower playstyle and never dies and also just puts in a bunch of work, Assassination might be for you. So, moving on to the A tier, we have the Arcane Mage. Arcane Mages are doing really well right now because they have probably the strongest burst single target damage in the entire game, which makes them incredibly useful. In addition to having some really strong single target, they also have a ton of great defensives with things like Ice Block, Altered Time, and of course the new Greater Invis. And then of course you have the standard mage buff stuff like Arcane Intellect, as well as Time Warp. All of these things combined make Arcane Mages the go-to spec for mages, and they're a really strong pick for any raid roster. Unholy Death Knights, like Arcane, have some of the strongest burst DPS in the game, which puts them up at the top of the meters. On top of having some really strong burst, thanks to a spell called Soul Rend, Unholy has some actually really powerful execute damage on mobs under 35% health. Aside from that, Unholy has some really strong raid-wide defensives like Anti-Magic Zone and Death Grip, which is always great for pulling mobs in to be grouped. Overall, Unholy is a great pick for any melee DPS player that's looking to do good damage, as well as have some great utility for the raids. Havoc Demon Hunters are kind of a jack of all trades. They can do everything, but not excelling in one particular aspect. They can do really good single target and AoE, and they have some of the strongest 2 to 5 target cleave than any spec in the game. That, combined with the fact that they have Chaos Brand, which is going to increase your party or raid's magic damage, puts them in a powerful raid spot. And then of course you can't forget about Darkness. Balanced Druids have a lot of great things going for them, but while they may not have the best single target damage in the game, they have a really strong toolkit which will help round out any raid team with things like Mark of the Wild, Innervate, and of course Stampeding Roar. Boomkins are great for any kind of multi-target fight because of things like having all their dots, and Starfall, which is just a nice little constant AoE damage throughout the entire fight. So if you guys like to play ranged and also have a ton of utility to help out your group, Boomkins are a great pick. Devastation Invokers are the new kids on the block, and while people may still be trying to figure out their usefulness or their place in the meta, they're in the A tier because right now they're doing some pretty good AoE and single target damage. But on top of that, they're also incredibly mobile, so having those things makes them pretty good. And while their utility is there, it's just not as good as some other specs. Lastly, for the A tier, I'm going to put the Beast Mastery Hunter here, and I know I'm probably going to get a ton of flack for this, but the reason why I'm putting them in the A tier is, while they're not going to be topping any damage meters, they do have a couple things going for them. First off, they're pretty decent as far as single target goes, and they're the only spec in the game that can do their entire rotation while moving, which is an incredibly underrated thing to have, especially for progression fights. Now sure, they don't really have any burst damage. Their DPS profile is mainly just like a steady flow of damage, and if there's any spec in the game that embodies the mantra of slow and steady wins the race, it's definitely BM Hunters. And that kind of damage profile, it's pretty nice to have. So now let's check out with the B tier, and starting off we have the Frost Death Knight. Frost is known for their strong AoE and cleave damage, and in a perfect world I'd put them in the A tier, but the main drawback for Frost is that if they're targeted with any kind of mechanic, and they need to run out from melee while they're using their long DPS cooldowns, their damage is kinda screwed. But aside from that, like Unholy, they have some awesome utility like Death Grip and Anti-Magic Zone, which both are invaluable for raids. Subtlety Rogues have some pretty good single target as well as AoE cleave damage, but Assassination does better single target, and Outlaw does better AoE. Sub is just not beating either of those in either respective damage. However, they're still pretty decent in the right hands. But like all rogues, they also have some strong defensives, and of course they bring that new poison. Windwalker Monks are pretty similar to Havoc, as they're a jack-of-all-trades kind of DPS spec. They provide strong burst AoE and some pretty good single target damage. They also provide some really great utility with things like Generous Pour, Close to the Heart, and of course Mystic Touch. Like Havoc, I would argue that every raid needs at least Windwalker Monk on their roster. So if you're into high API playstyles and love Bruce Lee flicks, Windwalker is a great choice. Frost Mage is one of the more weaker mage specs to play currently. They have some okay sustained single target damage, but where they shine is mainly in funnel damage or 2 to 3 target cleave. But like all mage specs, Frost has a ton of defensives, so they're pretty good for progression fights. But unfortunately, with just how good Arcane Mage is doing right now, it's probably more better to just play an Arcane Mage instead of Frost, unless you're just someone that just totally loves the spec. And then with Fire Mages, just like Frost, they're not the best spec for mages to play currently. Fire is all about cooldowns, and the whole spec and just rotation revolves around Ignite and Combust. And right now, Fire is one of those specs that just scales with gear. So as the expansion goes on and we start getting more and more higher itemable gear, then Fire will start to climb, but as of right now they're just not doing as good as Arcane. Elemental Shamans are strong choices for the raids because they excel at dealing high amounts of single target, cleave, and AoE damage. They have a number of abilities that allow them to increase their damage output, which makes them valuable assets in many raid groups. In addition, they have strong defensive abilities that can help them survive in combat, such as Earth Shield. Overall, Elemental Shamans are powerful damage dealers, and they can contribute a significant amount to the team. Marksmanship Hunters are really only good for situations where they're doing sustained AoE. They do really good damage for 3 to 5 target cleave, and they have some decent AoE burst. But for right now, their single target damage is lacking, and they don't have a ton of defensive cooldowns, so it makes them a little bit squishy. Arms Warriors have some really strong 2-target cleave, thanks to sweeping strikes, and of course they're known for their execute damage to any targets below 20% health, which makes having at least one warrior in the group for DPS really awesome. And on top of that, they have some pretty good buffs like Battle Shout, and a raid-wide buff which is going to be really awesome for oh crap moments called Rallying Cry. And then Fury Warriors are quite similar to Arms, in the sense that they're bringing the same kind of cooldowns, but their single target damage is a little lacking. They excel on low target sustained cleave type situations, which is why I think Arms and Fury are pretty much interchangeable, so just, grab one or the other. Ret Paladins have received some buffs in their damage, which is now I think why they're going to be in the B tier. They have some really strong burst damage, and they can provide some pretty good utility with things like Devotion Aura, and crazy clutch things like Lay on Hands. It's going to be interesting to see if they can maintain the spot in the meta, but for right now I think they're in a pretty good spot. Feral Druids have also received some pretty good buffs since last expansion, and they're now in a more prominent spot on the meta. Just like Balance Druids, Feral have a ton of utility for the raid, and some really strong AoE cleave. The only downside is that Feral takes up one of the valuable melee spots. Shadow Priests bring some decent single target and AoE damage. At the moment, they're just kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of damage for the raid. However, they do have some pretty nice buffs like Power Infusion, which is probably one of the most best and sought after buffs in the game. On top of that, they're also bringing Fort and Mass Dispel, and also they can grab Vampiric Embrace in a pinch. For the final spec in the B tier, we have the Demonology Warlocks. Now, Demo right now are just kind of doing meh as far as single target, but they actually have some really strong cleave and AoE damage. It all just depends on their talent choices. They of course also bring some of the best utility to the game with things like Demonic Gateway, Soul Stones, and Health Stones, which is why, let's face it, Warlocks are always going to have a spot in the raid team because of their utility. Destruction Warlocks have some pretty okay single target damage and really good 2-target cleave when they're using Infernal. Their AoE is also pretty good too, but they suffer because, they have really long cooldowns, which kind of hurts their DPS. But like all Warlock specs, they have some really awesome utility. Now moving on to the C tier, we're starting out with the Affliction Warlocks. So out of all the Warlock specs, Affliction Warlocks are probably doing the weakest as far as damage goes. So unless you just really love the spec, I would advise playing one of the other ones. And lastly, we have the Survival Hunter. As of right now, Survival has definitely been knocked down a peg or two since Shadowlands. They suffered pretty hard because in Shadowlands their damage was all about their legendaries, which they don't have access to anymore. They do some pretty weak single target and AoE, and like all hunters, they're pretty squishy. So if you're playing Hunter, I would argue play BM or Marksman right now. And that'll wrap up this video. You guys may have noticed that no specs are in the D tier. Honestly, I think every spec in the game right now is fine to play, except if you're playing Affliction or Survival when you're trying to do like really high-end rating. And unless you're in Cutting Edge and you're just doing Heroic or Normal, every spec here is going to be totally fine. But I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. What do you guys think about my ranking? You guys think I'm just totally wrong on all this stuff? Either way, let me know in the comments. And like always guys, thank you so much for checking out my video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.